Hey everybody, it's John, and I'm here with Marc Victor again from Attorneys for Freedom. And we have a discussion today. I want to expand a discussion from one of our previous videos that are on the main channel and talk about the legal aspects of being a third party and stepping into a third party encounter. So let's talk about it. Today's video is brought to us by the generosity of Firearms Legal Protection. Firearms Legal Protection is a legal defense program for lawful gun owners. You win the fight, and they will help you win the fight after the fight for the rest of your life. There's a link in the description for a coupon code for a discount for all active self-protection watchers. If you haven't seen Marc on the channel before, Marc is one of the premier attorneys here in Arizona, and certainly one of the most respected self-defense attorneys here in Arizona, and also a member of the Network for Firearms Legal Protection. And Marc, you watched this particular video, and I'm gonna put a link in here for you to watch it too. Pretty straightforward video with an attempted carjacking. Right?
I think so. And I got to say, I really liked your analysis here. I think what's very important that I think a lot of people miss is that there's a distinction between a legal duty and a moral duty, right?
Well, talk to us. I got to hear this.
This is important stuff, I think, because people confuse these things. In fact, it's a substantial issue that I talk about quite frequently in terms of just promoting freedom, right? Because freedom requires that other people get to make decisions about moral rights and moral wrongs, right? Freedom is the legal question, really, which is what I call the lowest common denominator, maybe, of our moral agreements with each other. That's the law. And so the law doesn't say generally that you got to help anybody.
Right.
Now, if you put somebody in a position where they're likely to suffer harm, right? Like, for example, you cause a car accident, you accidentally push somebody in a pool, something like that, then you got a legal duty to get involved and help that person.
Because you created the problem to begin with.
Absolutely, and this makes sense, right? You put the person in this position. But if you had nothing to do with that and you're just simply a bystander, you're not under a legal duty to render any aid. In fact, there are some states that have what we call Good Samaritan laws that say, look, if you do want to intervene, you're free from liability unless you do something terribly unreasonable, maybe gross negligence or something like that. So you have to recognize, as you point out in the video, that if you are going to opt to get involved, right, if you're going to opt to do something that the law doesn't require you to do, which is to help somebody else who's in danger or peril that you did not put them in, well, you have some things to consider, right? I mean, you might do so in a way that subjects yourself or your family, as you pointed out in the video, to legal liability, right? If you help and you get it wrong, you could be sued. Also, take this video for example. You may not know everything that's going on. Let's say what's actually going on here is the bad guy who comes to the window of the car. Let's say he's actually an undercover police officer who has a warrant for arrest of the person inside the car.
Right.
And you get involved because you maybe very reasonably think that you're stopping a carjacking. But as it turns out, the guy you just threw off says, hey man, that lady right there was some big dangerous criminal. Here's my badge, here's my arrest warrant. You just obstructed an investigation or whatever, and you're now going to jail. This is a risk that you take in some states. Arizona is not one of them.
Because of, again, I think in most places, now I guess I'm saying generally here, but I'd love to get your thought. A reasonable belief, if you act on a reasonable belief and you act reasonably based on that belief, you're probably okay from a legal perspective?
Well, actually, there's some competing theories here. And Arizona...
This is why I ask the questions, guys.
Arizona follows the minority rule, which I think is the better rule. But let me tell you about the majority rule first, because I think it might be a little bit easier to understand. And the majority rule says, look, if you want to defend a third party, then you stand in the shoes of that third party. So if they couldn't do it, you can't do it on their behalf. That seems pretty reasonable, right? The problem is that hurts us in the situation I just described, doesn't it? So Arizona follows a different rule. Arizona has a section, I think it's Title 13, Section 204, off the top of my head. I could be wrong about that, but it's called ignorance or mistake of fact. And basically what it says is, look, if you are mistaken about the facts, right? But if the facts had been as you thought they were, if you would have been justified under those facts, then it's not a criminal matter. It may still be a civil matter.
May still be a civil matter.
May still be a civil matter, but at least not a criminal matter. And I think that rule makes sense because in a criminal matter, really we always look at two pieces of the puzzle, or almost always, which is what you did, the actus reus, and what you were thinking when you did what you did, the mens rea portion. Almost all crimes have both of those things. Some crimes, unfortunately, in my opinion, like DUI in most states, don't have a mens rea requirement. If you did it, you did it. It doesn't matter how careful you were. But in the case of this video, say, for example, with my hypothetical, the mens rea portion isn't present, right? No. The bad mens rea, the stuff that we want to punish people for thinking bad things and intending to do bad things, that's just not present anymore. Right. And so I think Arizona's rule and the other states that follow similar rules probably is the better rule in this case.
But as always, because people from all over the country are watching this, you have to check which version of that your state follows and what your jurisdiction is. And I can't tell you that, which means you need to, and again, I've said this many times, and I'm sure I'd love to get your thoughts on this part too, that sometimes people read the statute and they go, oh, I understand it. No, that statute's not written in English. It's written in lawyer. And so you need to get a lawyer to give you a lawyer to English translation of what it actually means based on case law, based on an understanding of what's going on in your jurisdiction. So make sure you got that. Thoughts there?
The only thing I would say there, it's not really lawyer speak. The issue is that we need to be precise about these things because it's important, because people go to prison or not based on what these statutes mean. Yeah. So what was said and what was intended are very important things, and often sometimes not the same thing, right? And so it's very important to take a very close look. And also there are other considerations. There are due process considerations. For example, one of the due process considerations is you have to have notice of what's illegal. And if the law is written in a way that's somewhat ambiguous or it's not clear to the average person, well then, this is why we have courts, and they have to interpret those statutes. And so what they sometimes do is look at things like legislative history, what other cases have interpreted things to mean, what other situations that may use the same language have had to say. So it's really fraught with peril, I would say, to just simply read the statute and say, oh, I get what that means, and I know how it applies in all situations. I mean, these are the things that sometimes we lawyers are fighting about, right? And there are many situations where we don't have a clear answer. This is why we have appellate courts and why we have Supreme Courts, because we really don't know what the answer is. So I think it's important to say that if you're going to get out of your car, like this good guy, I would say, did, to help this woman, I think it was a female in the car, that's fine. As a moral matter, we like people like this, right? Sure. We love to encourage that, and I think the law ought to encourage that kind of thing. But you take a lot of risks, not just the legal risks we talked about, but also physical risks. Yeah. This idiot could have pulled out a gun or a knife or something and said,
look, just punched you in the face.
Punched in the face, anything. I mean, the guy who steps out of the car to stop this carjacking could have lost his life in this situation very easily, right? If the attempted carjacker pulled out a gun and just went pop, that's pretty much the end of that. Yeah. Even if this guy was armed, sometimes the bad guys win, right? Despite the amount of training that you have and everything else. So when you put yourself in that position, you take on a lot of risk. And as you said, very accurately in the original video, this is the kind of thing you got to think through for yourself. And I think you've said this in many videos, and it's something that comes up a lot, and it's an excellent point. And none of us have a good guide to tell another person what types of things they might want to do to help their fellow human beings.
Well, and if you're sitting in the moment and you're making that calculus of risk, and you haven't thought about it in advance, well, now you've got to do that calculation so fast. If instead you watch something like this and you're sitting in the comfort of your own home or whatever, and you think, gosh, who would I step in for? Then you're at least ready in the moment, and you've made your decisions simpler. And I think that's important. So I think, as I'm thinking through what you said earlier, though, Mark, in a state where it's an alter ego type statute, that I'm stepping into their shoes, if I don't know the whole situation, that makes me far less likely, because I could misinterpret. In a state like Arizona, where my reasonable belief of what the events are, then maybe I'm more apt from a legal perspective, because as long as what I see reasonably says this is what I saw in that, then I'm less kind of overhanging from a legal perspective.
Yeah, again, I think, and I've said this before too, I think Arizona's rules in this area is actually pretty good. Not just the specific statutes that we talked about, but just self-defense generally.
In general.
I think Arizona does a pretty good job at trying to sort of do the balance between a person's right to defend themselves and also a person's right to be free against someone else's use of excessive force.
Yeah.
So, and the other thing that I would just add on to what you said, this idea of thinking it through in advance, I think that's great. I think it's always better to be more prepared than less prepared, but you can't really think through every circumstance.
You can't.
Right? I mean, you could think of through this circumstance, but there again, what if you had an 8-year-old boy who's pounding? That may be less of a risk than this guy here. And so it's hard to think of every sort of variation of every unique situation that could come up. And oftentimes, you've got only a second or two to think this through, and there's really not an easy way to do it. I think that you just got to do the best you can and act reasonably. I mean, so much of the law in this area turns on one word: reasonableness, right? I mean, when I talk about Fourth Amendment and self-defense, I always make the point that, look, this stuff turns on reasonableness, or said another way, this stuff turns on what a randomly selected group of citizens from the community in which the act occurred thinks is reasonable. If they think you acted reasonably, you go home.
Yep.
If they think you acted unreasonably, you go somewhere else, which you don't want to go to.
Where you don't want to go. And if you are in, rural East Texas, that's going to be different than if you live in Boston.
For sure.
That's going to be a very different group of people. So, and then of course, I think from a moral perspective, there are some things that are so shocking to the conscience of humanity that we have to step in, right? So that you say, listen, whatever the case may be, from a perspective. I mean, you think about something like an active murderer or something, in your congregation. Do you have a legal mandate to step in and help? No, you don't have a legal mandate, but do you have a moral one?
Yeah, this is the other side of the equation. This isn't a legal question. This isn't something for a lawyer. This is a question for a human being about their time that they spend on the planet. What kind of human being do I want to be? Do I want to live with myself in a circumstances, let's just say some girl was getting raped, and I could have stopped it, but I just said, hey, this is not someone I know. I don't want to live like that.
Yeah.
And I can tell you right now, I'm not going to act like that, no matter what's going on. So I'm going to take action in the more serious cases, like you say. And, maybe it was more reasonable for this guy to just sit in the car and take a picture of the bad guy here and get the license plate of the car if indeed they drive off, maybe follow him and get on the phone and say, I'm following him, here's where we're going right now.
Right.
That could have maybe been a more reasonable way to resolve it. On the other hand, if this guy, say, stabs her, kills her or something like that, and you could have prevented it, then you have to live with the fact that you failed to act.
Yeah.
So there really isn't a right answer here, and there's not general advice that either one of us can give. It's the kind of thing you got to sit down and think about, what kind of person do I want to be while I'm on the planet?
I think that's excellent. And I just encourage you to think through that now. What kind of thing am I going to step into? I hear you, I'm just talking for me personally, I hear you say, listen, if I see a woman being dragged off into the bushes, I can't stand by. That to me is so shocking to the conscience. I can't stand by and let that happen. Right. I'm going to step in. I see two guys having a fist fight in the parking lot. Hey man, that's not my circus and not my monkeys. Two dudes just having a fist fight. And so you get to decide that. And I just encourage you to sit down and think about that. And maybe that is something for you to talk over with your spouse, with your family, with your boss even, and your coworkers, and go, hey, if something goes down, this is what's happening. So having that general principles at least,
and I would say
together.
The people who are legislators who make the law really ought to think about this kind of stuff. Do we want to punish people who acted with the right intentions in their heart?
Right.
Do we want to, even if they got it wrong, do we want to punish people? I don't think we do.
I don't think we do either. I don't think we do. And so good stuff for all our legislators out there. So, this is a funny one, because I'm just going to say this here on camera. Before we filmed, Mark, and we watched this stuff, you said, hey, I don't know that there's a whole lot to talk about here. And yet here we are with a good, significant bit of stuff, always good stuff. So Mark, thank you so much for your thoughts and for the help here.
Thanks for having me.